when you talk about employees, this global talent, global clientele and challenges, and also maintaining employee well-being with it, I would like to know, how can a company's approach to employee engagement contribute to effective retention, right? Because worldwide, in the last 1.5 years, there was a termed coin for it. The retention of employees, specifically the high performing individuals, is very, very important. So how can a company approach this through employee engagement?
I think, Sudhanshu, that's a great question, because it's something which is very close to my heart. I think employee engagement has been there for the last 29 years, and trying different things. There's enough of research out there in the market, whether it's Gallup or somebody else, who's talked about the fact that a great employee engaged workforce brings in greater profits. There's enough of research. I don't want to quote it, but it's there for all to see. Now, in that context, looking at high performers, that they are the cream of the organization, and if you're not retaining them, then obviously there's going to be greater amount of instability in your organization. And I think that's something which at Infosys BPM, to a great extent, I think we've been able to do. One is addressing the very junior folks who come in, right? Who's come in yesterday. It's a large organization. They're kind of at times at disarray. How do we continue to engage them, right? On the one hand, business talks about being local. Now, how do we address the mass and yet personalize specifically to individuals, right? How do you create that kind of balance of macro and micro? Now, looking at high performers, they're looking at challenge, they're looking at projects, they're looking at being part of high performing teams. They obviously are looking at a greater amount of a reward share, within the organization. But I think from an engagement perspective, number one, mentoring is something that has really worked for us, very, very well. The other is, in fact, creating of clubs, where we have something called the Club Elite, Club Stalwarts, Club Chevaliers. Now, these are clubs which are created to ensure that we somewhere engage these high performers at different categories, and of course the kind of reward, the kind of exposure, the projects, the leadership exposure that they get, and of course opportunities to learn and grow. Now, these are aspects which obviously excite high performers. And while you have a lot more for the mass, this is specifically for our high performers that we do.
Wonderful initiatives. You have a Gurukul, IOCO mentoring programs, which you facilitate cool mentors across the globe, monitoring people for success. Can you highlight how these initiatives have positively facilitated? Because you said mentoring has worked really well for you in terms of high potential employees. So how are these mentoring initiatives perceived within the organization?
You've done some good work, Sudhanshu, in terms of asking me the questions, because these are very, very close to my heart. So I'll give you, this is one is Gurukul and the other is IECO, which is Infosys. ECO stands for EOCO, which is each one connect one. That's the basic abbreviation. About 7 years ago, we were looking at our attrition data, and suddenly we realized that our attrition in the range of about 0 to 12 months vintage was not a very happy situation. And we kind of sat together along with the CEO doing some brainstorming, and we realized that for now, immediately we possibly couldn't make any large investment. But yes, we said having leaders spend some time with junior employees would actually make a difference. We never thought the great difference that it would actually make. So we had every leader in the organization commit to just 1 hour a month, and we got about 20-25 employees who would be connected to this particular leader. So it was an exercise in group mentoring, not a one-on-one group mentoring. But during these conversations, the leader would talk about career, would talk about the organization, would talk about the industry, would also talk about his own growth trajectory. And many a times it was great excitement both for the mentees as well as for the mentors, because the mentors were also sharing their lives, their authenticity, their credibility in the organization. Now that is something which create, while we had leaders, team managers managing these people, but this we realized that employees who were part of this Gurukul group, or you call a club, the retention was much higher. In fact, at that moment of time, our attrition about 7 years ago in this group was in the range of about 45%, and it gradually dipped. Today, even as we speak, the business has actually benefited from it because our attrition is in the range of about below 5%. Now that's a phenomenal addition, value add to the business, right? In every way, from a cost context, from every context. So Gurukul, obviously, this was something which we rolled out in India, and then we realized the benefits of Gurukul, and then we rolled it out for China, for Costa Rica, for Czech Republic, for Poland. So basically, globally, we were, and even our global employees were able to embrace it under different banners. We didn't keep Gurukul because Gurukul, the name would not sound great to them. So they took a name, they branded it the way they wanted it, and they found great joy. So that is something which we realized. And while we looked at our data, we looked at everything that was happening positive, we said, why not explore mentoring as an opportunity globally? And that's when we rolled out IECO, where we talked about each one connect one. What the philosophy is that if every manager just spends a little time connecting just one person, we're not talking about more than one, just a leader connects just one person, spends time, talks about career, talks about some personal challenges, whether it's physical challenges or whatever challenges that the individual might have. We believe that it will have a multiplying effect in the organization. Yeah. And in fact, we've kind of created a portal. We've in fact created corners, for people. So we've not only looked at specifically very generic mentoring, but we've also now looked at domain-centric mentoring. So we've looked at finance and accounting mentoring. So, mentors. So what we've done is we've trained about 200 mentors across the globe. And we've said, if you need any support in finance and accounting, you can choose any mentor, but then there are finance and accounting mentors. There are sourcing and procurement mentors. There are HR mentors. You name it, it's there for you. So what we've done is we've kind of created a portal. So it's a kind of a cafeteria approach. An individual feels, I'm feeling low today, let me talk to a mentor. Let me reach out to somebody and then kind of talk. Or I want help, I want to move from F&A to sourcing and procurement. Why not talk to somebody who's a leader in sourcing and procurement, and then get my way out? And of course, whether it's careers, whether it's personal challenges, whether it's professional challenges, growth, learning, all of those issues, something which we've realized has been able to solve. And I think the levels of motivation itself, our employee engagement scores are telling us that.
A lot of very good points and a lot of pointers for HRs in the last 4-5 minutes of your conversation. The one thing that I've realized also is people, especially when they start up, when they are in the early years of their career, they somehow have this mindset that leadership, people sitting on the top, they're possibly made of a different clay.
Absolutely.
And, when you open portals like this, when you open doors where you can sit with somebody who has aced it for 25-30 years, and that person brings a very personal element to that conversation, which makes that person human. You're not just talking to a director or a VP but you're talking to a person who has possibly grown the same path as yours. That becomes very, very motivating in different ways for employees. Let's talk about the women centricity in your organization, where women inspire other women, which obviously is a great idea, right? Can you share through an anecdotal story from your experience of how women-centric initiatives have been a stepping stone in enhancing employee engagement, specifically in younger women?
A very good question and very relevant to our times, because I think the aspect of diversity is something which is top of mind. Most organizations are looking at it. In fact, our own CEO has got diversity in his scorecard. So which, generally, at least the CEO may not take. It's more, the HR head who takes that kind of scorecards. But in our case, I think it's the CEO who has a scorecard, a diversity. In fact, we have looked at diversity very broadly, but also very narrowly. And we've kind of got councils. So we've got an Indian diversity council, we've got globals, and we've got each country. So the Americas, Europe has got their own councils. Now, during these discussions that we have as part of being the Diversity Council, we look at processes, policies, systems. Are they in some way not taking care of our women employees, right? And we see what is that change that is required. We've also been able to look at policies. There are been policies already. So we've reviewed each of our policies and seen how is it that we can make them more women-centric. So we've got, for example, we've tweaked our part-time policy. We've tweaked our maternity policy. We've tweaked, our policy in terms of work from home. So there is that flexibility that we realize we need to provide our lady employees. In fact, at the leadership level, we realized that we have 17% of our leaders who are women. Now, while that is globally a pretty good number, and a lot of our clients may not have that kind of a number, but we obviously are not happy with that number, and 25% is a kind of a target that we've taken to ensure that we can improve our leadership, our women leadership, to about 25% of the total leadership across the organization. What we've also done is, one of the things that you would have read, HBR and a lot of other magazines talk about pay parity, and that's something which again year on year we've looked at our women compensation, and we've seen how is it that we can bring about that kind of parities for women. Yeah? And finally, of course, speaking very close to my heart in terms of the IECO initiative, on our portal we created a women's corner, and what we've done is we've also trained some of our women leaders to be mentors. Therefore, women should feel comfortable. They may want to speak about some things. They may want to talk about the glass ceiling. They may want to talk about certain greater amount of flexibility within the organization. So that's something which we've provided for, so that, and we kind of nudge our women employees to speak to these women mentors. Besides that, we've got several learning initiatives for our women, both at a global level as well as at an India level, to see how is it that women can also groom themselves to be not only, domain professionals, but also as leaders, as people leaders across the globe. And that's something we are already seeing greater amount of success. So we believe that we've got a long way to go. We are still touching, the tip of the iceberg, and we believe that we've got to consistently sense and respond to the requirements of our women employees.
Absolutely. I must congratulate you and your organization for all this effort and women-centric efforts, as well as other efforts that you have taken. Can you shed some light on your personal favorite initiatives in your long career as an HR, and employee engagement and learning, and how does learning and those different strategies that have gained and have driven employee engagement through your experience as an HR?
If you're asking me for my favorite, Gurukul has been my favorite. IECO has been my favorite. Both are my babies. But let me share something which, while we rolled out some of our initiatives for the mass and for, at a global level, we also receive feedback from leadership telling us that, you do a lot of engagement, you have a lot of fun, you do a lot of engagement for people at the junior level, at mid level. But what about us leaders? Why do you leave us out? Because we are also employees and we also want to feel engaged. While yes, leaders are expected to engage themselves on their own, but what about some support from the organization? And that's when we got feedback while having taken feedback from the leaders.
Can you shed some
We
light on
created this
your
group
personal
called the
favorite
CEO Squad.
initiatives in your
Now, the
long
CEO
career as
Squad
an
is a
HR?
group of 15,
And
16 employees.
employee engagement
This
and
group is
learning, and
created
how does
of senior
learning
leaders
and
with
those
obviously
different
a certain
strategies
criteria, which
that have
is
gained
performance
and
as well
have
as
driven employee
people-centric
engagement through your
criteria.
experience
We
as
do
an
this
HR?
once in a year. If you're asking me for my favorite Gurukul, has been my favorite. IECO has been my favorite. They all, I mean, both are my babies. They are then certified, but and let me share signed off by while the executive council some of our initiatives for the and then we start our program, and this program is for a year at a global level. Now, during we also this 1 year feedback the leaders are provided telling us that you do a lot of engagement, you do a lot of growth, you have a lot of fun, you do a lot of engagement for people to drive at the junior level, initiatives to address employees. What about us leaders as well as why do you leave us out? Because we are also employees and we also want this group of employees. While yes, leaders are expected to engage themselves on this program, on their own, they are aligned to the CEO of the organization. Which means, and that's when they get opportunities to connect directly one-on-one and
can you shed some light on your personal
besides that, they
favorite
also get to
initiatives
shadow
in
the
your
CEO,
long career
which
as
means
an HR?
if the
And
CEO is
employee
spending time with the
engagement
client,
and learning, and how
with the
does
team meeting,
learning
they
and
are sitting
those
down,
different
sitting by
strategies
his side
that have
and
gained
seeing how he operates,
and
how
have
does he
driven
communicate,
employee
what is his
engagement
story,
through
what
your
are his
experience
success
as an
stories,
HR?
what are his loneliness. If you're asking me for my favorite, in that context, they get my favorite. IECO has been my favorite. They all, I mean, both are my babies. But let me share something aligned, which, while we rolled out some of our initiatives for the, and at the end of the program, we create a kind of we also receive feedback from leadership of the leaders, telling us who are then you do a lot of engagement, you do a lot so that these we have a lot of fun, who are high performers, for people who have gone at the junior level, at mid level. But what about us leaders? Why do you leave us out? Because we are also employees and we also this is want to become now. While yes, and leaders are expected to engage themselves on on their own. Actually, what about to be part of the organization? They obviously, and that's when do a lot to influence leaders, the CEO, to ensure that they
can
are
you shed
part
some
of the
light
group.
on
Obviously,
your personal
there is an
favorite
objective criteria
initiatives
that is
in your
created.
long career
This
as an HR?
has been able to
And
help us to
employee
create leaders from
engagement and
within.
learning, and
Right?
how does
So while they are high
learning and
performers,
those
they come to
different
the coach, they get
strategies
an
that
exposure
have
to
gained
people, they get an
and
exposure
have
to
driven
leadership,
employee engagement
and then of course
through your
they're there
experience
ready
as an
to
HR?
take on larger. If you're asking me for my favorite, Gurukul has been my
Absolutely,
favorite.
I'm
IECO
quite
has been my favorite. They all, I
as
mean,
an
both
HR
are my
myself,
babies.
pretty
But
inspired
let
with
me
the
share
multiple
something which,
initiative
while
across
we
all
rolled out
levels.
some of our initiatives
And
for the,
how
for the
do you
mass
drive
and for
aspiration
at a global level,
and that
we also
enthusiasm
receive
of
feedback
participation
from
in
leadership
programs? Because
telling us
the one
that you do a lot of
constant
engagement, you
pain
do
in
a
the
lot of
L&D
we have a lot of
community
fun,
has
you do a
been,
lot of
of course, we
engagement
do
for people
initiatives, but
at
how
the
do you
junior
get
level,
people
at mid level. But
enthusiastic
what about
and
us
invested
leaders?
in that? So
Why
there are
do
some
you
really
leave us
nice
out? Because we
initiatives.
are also.
At an individual level, we do a lot of stuff to keep ourselves in good spirits, right? But as an organization level, for a leader, how does mindfulness and being an authentic leader, how does it play at an organization? And how do these elements of being mindful in all situation, being authentic about your leadership, given different scenarios happening in the organization, how does that contribute to a positive workplace culture?
Fantastic question, Sudhanshu, because again, as an organization, Infosys BPM is driving a culture of authentic leadership. And I'm very passionate about it. I take every opportunity to write on LinkedIn again on this particular subject. An engaged workforce is driven by leaders. Yeah? And if leaders are not authentic, if leaders are not credible, if leaders are not driven by values, if leaders are not walking the talk or talking the walk, if they are not practicing integrity, for example, if they are not fair, yeah, and if they are not driving for excellence, it becomes very difficult for today's youth to be engaged. They also are looking at leaders who will not only lead them but also lead by example in that sense. And it's only when they see leaders who are there, who are authentic in themselves, who are credible, who have proven themselves in the process, that's when they begin to follow. And I believe that therefore employee engagement, to have an engaged workforce, I strongly believe that it has to be coming from the top, yeah, where there is authenticity, where there are values. And I've seen that in our organization. In fact, we've driven this as a movement of authentic leadership across the organization, where the first program of authentic leadership was attended by our top leaders. The executive council and the CEO themselves attended a program, created an authentic leadership model specifically for Infosys BPM. And then of course then we've had the entire program, down. It's not about the program, it's about, as I said, leading by example. It's about walking the talk, it's about talking the walk. And I think that's the most important thing. And it's only when today's youth, they're very clear, right? If they see something in your policy manual, something that is being practiced, they simply are not engaged, right? And they're very vocal about it. And I think that's the beauty of this, driving culture of authentic leadership across the organization.
Especially that, I'll come to this question later as well. Especially when we are seeing the more Gen Zs and coming into the organization, younger people with different expectations and different idea of workplace entering the workforce. The question about that is, of course, you are a certified coach. We have spoken about that again, and with the focus on the employee engagement. What would be your tip for HR professionals? Because I speak to HRs, and employee engagement, a workforce that is engaged, highly engaged, because it has multiple benefits. What would be your tip for HR professionals who are aiming to maintain a highly engaged workforce?
If you look at today globally, I think we are going through a lot of churn, a lot of complexities, automation, robotics, AI. Business continues to churn, lots of challenges, lots of complexities. The clients are also obviously becoming a lot more demanding, and looking inward, outward. What business today says is, I think you need to be global, global by which I mean you've got to be global, and yet you've got to be local. Now, in the same way, what I believe is, what makes the world very interesting is our differences and not so much of our similarities. And in spite of our differences, if HR professionals across and business leaders, they're called not only to paint the masses, but also to personalize your offerings, your initiatives. So on the one hand, you may drive initiatives which will engage people at a mass level, at an organization level. Today's youth are also looking at personalizing. If I join an organization, I want to be inducted in a manner which is personally, excites me. If I am going to be trained, I want to be trained at a time when I want to be trained, in the manner that I want to be trained. I don't want to be trained. I don't want to come into a conference room. I want to possibly sit at home on the weekend and go through my mobile, and that's something which I'll enjoy, learning in that process. So the idea is, on the one hand, you've got to manage scale, you've got to manage size, and yet you've got to provide a very personalizing employee experience. And that, I believe, is key in managing today's employee force. It's not an easy task. It's not an easy task for both business as well as for HR professionals. But I believe if this is something which we can continue to explore as an opportunity, I believe we can go miles ahead as required with the complexity, with the changing environment.